The first thing I noticed was not the backhoe. It was the lilac hedge. On what was left of it, twisted roots, snapped branches, and purple blossoms ground into the wet clay, like somebody had taken a family photograph and dragged it under a truck. Then I saw the machine sitting nearly 18 feet past my fence, its bucket buried in the same patch of yard where my husband and I used to drink coffee before he got sick. And standing beside it, perfectly calm in white sneakers and a cashmere robe, was my neighbor, Celeste Whitmore, smiling at me like she had just improved the view. I had lived in that house outside Bellwether, Pennsylvania, for 26 years, long enough to know every soft spot in the lawn, every stubborn maple root, every board in the back steps that creaked when the weather turned cold. My husband, Owen, planted those lilacs the spring our daughter left for college, saying the house needed something that would keep coming back even when people did not. He died 9 years later from pancreatic cancer, and after that, those bushes became more than plants. They became proof that some things could survive a bad winter and still find a reason to bloom. So when I walked outside at 6:40 in the morning and saw them torn apart before I had even poured my first cup of coffee, I did not feel angry at first. I felt hollow, the way you feel when someone opens a door you thought was locked and walks straight into the most private room of your life. One of the workers saw me coming and immediately pulled his hands away from the controls, which told me he had enough sense to realize this was not going to be a normal Tuesday. He was a stocky man with a gray beard and a company logo stitched over his shirt pocket, and he looked from me to Celeste, then back to the broken hedge. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. I pointed at the backhoe. "You can start by telling me why that thing is in my yard." Before he could answer, Celeste stepped forward and lifted her coffee like we were about to toast. "Morning, Ruth," she said. "I was wondering how long it would take you to come outside." That sentence did something to me. Not because it was loud or cruel, but because it was so casual. I looked at her, then at the trench running through my garden. "Come outside for what, exactly?" "To watch you steal my backyard." She gave me a small, patient smile, the kind people use when they have already decided you are confused. "Nobody's stealing anything, Ruth. We had the boundary resurveyed last month. The original markers were off. This strip has always belonged to my parcel." She held out a blue folder with silver clips, and I remember thinking even her bad news had better packaging than most people's wedding invitations. Inside were fresh maps, legal descriptions, stamped signatures, a letter from a law office in Harrisburg, and several pages with enough official language to make an ordinary homeowner question their own front porch. She tapped one of the diagrams with a polished fingernail. "My attorney suggested I give this to you personally. It should help us avoid unnecessary conflict." I looked past her shoulder and finally understood what the crew was building. Stacks of limestone sat beside a delivery truck. Steel framing had been unloaded near the property line, and a pallet of imported tile was wrapped in plastic beside a set of plans labeled Pool Pavilion. This was not a fence adjustment. Celeste was building a private country club, and apparently my memories had become an inconvenient corner of the floor plan. "You are telling me," I said, "that after 26 years, the property line moved 18 feet because you decided to add a swim-up bar?" Her smile tightened. "The line did not move. It was corrected. Funny how the correction happened to land exactly where your new patio needs to go." That was when her tone changed, just slightly, from neighborly to managerial. "Ruth, I know this is emotional for you, but emotion does not change title records. We have also documented maintenance and continuous use of the strip, irrigation access, landscaping, drainage work. My attorney believes we have a strong claim even if you challenge the survey." Then she turned to the foreman. "Keep going, Greg. We are already behind." The engine roared back to life, and the bucket lowered into the soil again. Every part of me wanted to step in front of it, call the police, throw the folder into her pool. Maybe all three. But I had spent 31 years as a facilities manager for a hospital system, and if there was one thing that job taught me, it was that panic is expensive and paperwork is patient. So I folded the documents, looked at the foreman, and said, "You might want to save every instruction she gives you in writing." He stared at me for half a second, then quietly reached for his phone. Celeste rolled her eyes. "Ruth, threats are not going to help you." "That was not a threat," I said. "That was maintenance advice." I walked back inside before she could answer, though my hands were shaking hard enough that I nearly dropped the folder on the kitchen floor. For the next hour, I sat at the table Owen built from old barnwood and tried to read every page Celeste had handed me, but the words kept blurring into the image of those lilacs under the tracks. There are moments when grief comes back quietly, and there are moments when it kicks the door open wearing muddy boots. That morning, it did both. Around 8, my brother called because Celeste had apparently posted a cheerful photograph of the construction crew online with the caption, "Finally reclaiming wasted space." I told him not to comment, not to call her, not to do anything that could be screenshotted and used later. He said, "Ruth, she bulldozed Owen's lilacs." "I know," I said, and hearing it out loud made my voice crack in a way I hated. After we hung up, I went to the basement, not because I had a plan, but because I remembered something my father once said when Owen and I bought the place. Dad had worked as a civil drafting technician for the county during the 70s and 80s, back when subdivisions were still drawn by hand and mistakes were corrected with red pencil instead of software. On closing day, he stood near the back fence, looked toward the utility poles, and told me, "Never trust a clean property map until you know it is buried under it." I had not thought about that sentence in decades. Down in the basement, behind Christmas decorations and boxes of Owen's old tools, I found my father's metal document case, dull green, dented at the corners, and heavier than I remembered. Inside were plats, permit copies, handwritten measurements, utility sketches, and photographs from when the neighborhood was still bare dirt and concrete pipes. Near the bottom sat a rolled plan marked Bellwether North Track C, underground services and access corridor. I carried it upstairs, spread it across the kitchen table, and used coffee mugs to hold down the corners. At first I saw only lines and symbols, then a heavy black band caught my eye, running directly beneath the strip Celeste had claimed. I leaned closer and read the note twice. Permanent municipal stormwater and high-voltage access easement, 24 feet wide. No permanent structures, unrestricted service entry. For the first time that morning, my hand stopped shaking. Celeste might have bought herself a survey, a lawyer, and enough stone to rebuild a Roman bathhouse. But she had just driven heavy equipment across a protected utility corridor serving half the neighborhood. And judging by the trench outside, she had no idea what was under her feet. I did not call the city right away. And that surprises people when I tell this story, because from the outside it seems obvious. You find a protected easement under an illegal construction site. You pick up the phone and end the whole thing before lunch. But grief makes you cautious in strange ways. And so does experience. I had spent too many years watching people rush into conference rooms waving one document like it was the Ten Commandments, only to discover they had misunderstood a note in the margin. I needed to know exactly what I had found, exactly where it ran, and exactly how much trouble Celeste had already created before I put my name behind any accusation. So I changed into an old pair of work boots, grabbed the tape measure, a notebook, my phone, and the rolled utility plan, then walked back outside through the side gate. The crew had moved farther into the yard by then. Greg, the foreman, was standing beside a stack of lumber while two workers marked the ground with white paint. Celeste had disappeared into her house, probably to take a call or approve another piece of imported stone no human being actually needed. Greg watched me approach and lowered his voice. "I am not trying to get caught in the middle of this," he said. "You already are," I told him, "but I might be able to keep you from getting buried in it." I opened the plan across the hood of his truck and showed him the access corridor. At first, he looked skeptical. Then he leaned closer, traced the heavy line with one finger, and glanced toward the excavation. "Nobody gave us this," he said. "Did you call for a utility locate before digging?" He hesitated just long enough to answer the question. "The client said the site had been cleared." "That is not what I asked." He rubbed his beard. "The designer gave us a survey and a permit packet." I looked at the orange and yellow utility flags scattered near Celeste's original patio, then at the blank strip running through my torn garden. There were no markings where the backhoe had crossed. Either the locate had never been requested for the expanded area, or somebody had ignored it. Greg pulled out his phone and started scrolling through emails. His face changed as he read. "I have written authorization from our project manager," he said quietly. "It says all underground conflicts were resolved before mobilization." "Save that," I told him. "Save everything." Then I began measuring. The corridor in my father's plan was 24 feet wide, centered on a buried stormwater line and a high-voltage feeder installed when the development was built. using the old reference points, the rear corner of my garage, the drainage inlet near the street, and the concrete marker half hidden under ivy. I mapped the route across the yard. It ran almost perfectly through the center of Celeste's new foundation trench, her future pool pavilion, outdoor fireplace, retaining wall, and part of the expanded pool deck all sat directly over it. Even worse, the backhoe had already dug deep enough to expose a section of gravel bedding that did not match the surrounding soil. I knelt near the trench and saw a scrape along a thick black conduit, fresh enough that the plastic still looked pale where the bucket had struck it. That was the moment the situation stopped being a property dispute and became something much more serious. A damaged storm drain could flood yards and basements, but a damaged electrical feeder could put a worker in the hospital or shut down several blocks. I stepped back and called the emergency number printed on the utility plan. The woman who answered introduced herself as Marisol Grant, Regional Infrastructure Coordinator. I explained who I was, what had been built, and what I had found. She asked me to repeat the address, then went silent for several seconds while typing. When she spoke again, the calm customer service voice was gone. Are workers actively excavating right now? Yes. Do not approach the trench. Do not touch any exposed material, and tell the operator to shut down immediately. I looked toward Greg, who's already waving both arms at the backhoe driver. The engine cut off. Marisol asked me to send photographs, measurements, and a copy of the plan, then said a response team was being dispatched. Celeste came out of her house less than 2 minutes later, moving quickly across the lawn with her phone in one hand. Why did the equipment stop? She demanded. Greg pointed at me. There may be an unmarked utility conflict. Her eyes narrowed. There is no conflict. The property was surveyed. A survey tells you where the land ends, I said. It does not tell you what the city is allowed to reach under it. I showed her the plan, but she barely looked. That document is 40 years old. So is the infrastructure. She folded her arms. You have no authority to stop my project. I did not stop it, I said. The possibility of your contractor hitting a high-voltage line stopped it. For one brief second, fear crossed her face, but pride covered it almost immediately. She called someone, spoke in a clipped whisper, then announced that her attorney was on the way. I almost laughed. I'd spent my entire career around administrators who believed every mechanical failure could be corrected by inviting another person in a suit. Pipes do not care who passed the bar exam. Electricity is even less impressed. 20 minutes later, the first utility truck arrived, followed by another, then a city inspection vehicle. Neighbors began drifting toward their porches with coffee cups and phones, pretending they were checking the weather. Marisol stepped out of the lead truck wearing a reflective vest and carrying a tablet. She introduced herself to me, reviewed the old plan, then walked the route with 2 technicians using detection equipment. Each time their instruments sounded, they marked to grass with red paint. The line appeared exactly where the old drawing showed it, directly beneath Celeste's new construction. One technician stopped near the trench and crouched. Nobody move any equipment, he called. His tone was so sharp that even Celeste went quiet. The crew widened the safety perimeter and carefully examined the scraped conduit. Marisol asked Greg for the excavation ticket number. He searched his paperwork again, called his office, then admitted the locate request covered only Celeste's original parcel improvements, not the 18-foot expansion her survey claimed. The change had been added after the first permit submission. Celeste turned on him instantly. That is your responsibility as the contractor. Greg did not raise his voice. Your project manager certified the revised area was clear, and you signed the change order. Her attorney arrived in a black sedan just in time to hear that sentence. He was younger than I expected, with a tailored suit, expensive shoes, and the expression of a man who had driven over expecting a boundary disagreement and found a live electrical hazard instead. He studied the markings, spoke privately with Marisol, then asked Celeste to step away from the neighbors. She refused. Whatever you have to say it here. He looked uncomfortable. This construction needs to remain suspended until the easement documents and permit history are reviewed. She stared at him. You told me the corrected survey gave me control of this strip. It may give you a claim to ownership, he said carefully, but ownership remains subject to recorded access rights. Her voice rose. Then get the easement removed. Marisol answered before the attorney could. That feeder serves 112 homes. Ma'am, we're not removing it so you can build an outdoor kitchen. Frankly, It was the first time I had seen Celeste speechless, and the silence suited her better than I expected. The inspectors posted a stop work notice on the temporary fence, bright red against the pale wood. Another notice went on the backhoe. The city inspector requested every permit, revision, engineering report, and excavation authorization connected to the project. By late afternoon, the workers had packed their tools, but the equipment remained trapped inside the restricted area until the utility company could determine whether it was safe to move. Celeste stood near her unfinished patio while neighbors watched from a polite distance. She looked at me across the torn ground and said, low enough that only I could hear, "You planned this." I shook my head. "No, Celeste, you planned it. I just found out what you planned it on top of." The next morning, utility crews returned with vacuum excavation equipment and exposed the conduit without using metal buckets. The damage was worse than the surface scrape suggested. One protective sleeve had cracked, and water had already begun seeping into the surrounding bedding. The electrical cable itself was still intact, but the engineer said continued pressure from the foundation and retaining wall could have caused insulation failure over time. A second discovery made the situation even uglier. The new drainage trench had partially crushed an older stormwater connection, which explained why 2 yards downhill had started holding water after every rain. By noon, the city upgraded the stop work order to an emergency remediation order. Nothing could continue until the damaged systems were repaired and permanent access restored. That meant removing the fresh footings, the retaining wall, portions of the pool deck, and every structure Celeste had placed inside the corridor. Her attorney filed an immediate appeal. Her surveyor blamed the architect. The architect blamed the project manager. The project manager stopped answering his phone. Greg handed the city every email he had saved, including the one where Celeste wrote that she was tired of delays and wanted excavation started before another neighbor could object. I never saw that email myself, but the inspector later told me it changed the entire tone of the investigation. This was no longer a simple oversight. Celeste had been warned there were unresolved site conditions, and she had pushed forward because she believed speed would create a finished fact nobody could undo. That evening, I sat on my back steps with a cup of tea, looking at the empty place where Owen's lilacs had been. Across the fence, Celeste argued with 3 people at once beneath the harsh glare of temporary work lights. I should have felt victorious, but I did not. Victory is a clean word, and real life rarely is. My yard was still destroyed. The neighborhood was facing a dangerous repair, and a woman who could have knocked on my door had chosen to arrive with machines and legal threats instead. Still, as the red stop work notice fluttered in the wind, I understood something I had not understood the morning before. Celeste thought power meant moving first, speaking confidently, and making everyone else react. She had never learned that the quietest thing in the argument can sometimes be the strongest. An old line on an old plan, buried beneath 40 years of soil, waiting patiently for somebody to read it. The final order came 6 weeks later, though by then nobody in Bellwether needed a lawyer to tell them how it was going to end. The utility easement had been properly recorded in 1981. The access corridor had never been abandoned, and no private survey, property claim, or landscaping agreement could erase the city's right to reach the infrastructure beneath it. Celeste was ordered to remove every permanent structure inside the protected zone, repair the damaged electrical conduit and stormwater connection, restore the access route, and cover the cost of engineering inspections, emergency crews, and permit violations. Her attorney appealed twice. Both times the answer came back the same. Owning the ground did not mean owning the right to block what served everyone underneath it. The demolition crew arrived on a gray Thursday morning, and I knew they were coming because Greg called me the night before. It was no longer working for Celeste, but he wanted me to hear it from him instead of waking up to another machine outside my window. At 7:15, a flatbed truck turned onto our street carrying a compact excavator, concrete saws, and steel dumpsters. The sound of diesel rolling down the block pulled me straight back to the morning my locks were destroyed. And for a few seconds I stood at the kitchen sink with both hands around my coffee, unable to move. Then I stepped onto the back porch. The first thing they removed was the limestone retaining wall. Each block had probably cost more than my first car, and the crew lifted them out one by one before dropping them into a container with a heavy crack. After that came the unfinished fireplace, the pool pavilion footings, the custom drainage channels, and part of the new deck. The imported tiles Celeste had bragged about, to half the neighborhood broke just as easily as anything else when the jackhammer reached it. There was something almost unfairly satisfying about that sound. Not because I enjoyed watching someone lose money, but because those materials had arrived in my yard, like a declaration that her plans mattered more than my home. Now they were leaving in pieces. Celeste came outside around 9. She looked different without the polished performance. No white sneakers, no oversized glasses, no coffee lifted like a prop. She wore an old navy coat over sweatpants and stood beneath the bare frame of her pavilion, while workers cut through the concrete she had poured over the easement. She watched for nearly an hour before walking toward my fence. I considered going inside, but Owen used to say that avoiding an uncomfortable conversation only gives it time to grow teeth, so I stayed where I was. You knew what would happen, she said. Her voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the machinery. I knew the easement existed, I replied. That is not what I asked. She looked toward the broken patio. You knew they would tear all of this out. Once the engineers confirmed the damage. Yes. She pressed her lips together. You could have warned me before you called them. I stared at her for a moment because I honestly could not believe we had reached that version of the story. Celeste, I walked into my own backyard while your crew was tearing out the lilacs my husband planted, and I asked why your machine was on my property. You handed me legal papers, told your foreman to keep digging, and called my grief an emotional issue. She looked down. I did not know what those plants meant to you. You did not ask. That landed harder than anything angry I could have said. Her shoulders dropped a little. And for the first time since she moved next door, I saw someone underneath all that certainty. Someone embarrassed, frightened, and maybe finally aware that confidence had carried her farther than good judgment ever could. She told me the renovation had started after her divorce because she could not stand the house being quiet. She had imagined parties, grandchildren, friends staying late, all the things she thought would prove her life was still moving forward. Somewhere along the way, every delay had begun to feel like another person telling her she had lost control. I listened because pain can explain behavior even when it does not excuse it. Then I said, I understand wanting to build something after losing a life you expected, but you tried to build yours on top of mine. She nodded once, wiped beneath one eye, and walked back toward her house. That was the closest thing to an apology I ever received. The bills kept arriving long after the demolition ended. The utility repair alone cost more than her original pool pavilion, and her insurance refused coverage because the investigation showed the excavation had continued after unresolved site warnings. The contractor filed a claim for unpaid labor. The city assessed penalties for unapproved revisions. Her surveyor and architect spent months blaming each other, while her attorney quietly withdrew from the final appeal. Reg avoided the worst of it because he had saved every message and stopped work as soon as he saw the utility plan. He later told me that one old email from Celeste had protected his entire company. Her line was simple. Start now, and we will solve the objections after the concrete is in. That sentence probably cost her more than all the stone in her backyard. Once the repairs were complete, the city installed permanent utility markers along the corridor. Bright, waist-high posts that looked about as elegant as parking meters in a flower bed. Celeste hated them, which I admit made them slightly more attractive to me. The part I did not expect came 3 weeks later when a landscaping truck pulled into my driveway carrying fresh soil and mature lilac bushes. The utility company had included restoration of my damaged yard in the settlement, and Marisol had personally requested plants large enough to bloom the following spring. One of the landscapers asked where I wanted them. I went inside and returned with an old photograph of Owen and me sitting on the back steps, the original lilacs rising behind us in a purple wall. He was laughing in the picture because our daughter had just told him his gardening hat made him look like a retired scarecrow. I handed the photo to the landscaper. As close to this as you can get, I said. They worked until late afternoon, shaping the bed, rebuilding the border, and placing each bush where the old roots had been. The new plants were not Owen's. I knew that. Memory does not work like replacement parts, and grief is not fooled by symmetry. Still, when the lights softened and the workers packed up, I sat on the porch with the photograph beside me and felt the house breathe differently. Sometimes restoration does not mean getting back what was lost. Sometimes it means refusing to let the damage have the final word. Celeste listed her house the following spring. I never asked whether the legal bills forced her out or whether she simply wanted to live somewhere the neighbors did not know the story. On moving day, she stopped at my driveway and handed me a small paper bag. Inside was a pair of gardening gloves and a handwritten note that said, "I should have listened before I started digging." It was not enough to erase what happened, but it was enough for me to stop carrying the anger around like broken concrete. People still ask whether I think I won. I do not know. The law protected my home. The utility system was repaired, and Celestine's private resort disappeared beneath the same machines she once sent into my yard. But Owen was still gone. The original lilacs were still gone, and 2 neighbors had needed lawyers, inspectors, and demolition crews to do what one respectful conversation might have prevented. So tell me what you think. Was I right to let the city handle everything once I found the plans? Or should I have given Celeste one final warning after she had already ignored me and ordered the digging to continue? Did she deserve the full consequences? Or did I let grief make the decision for me? Share your honest opinion in the comments. And if this story made you think about property, power, or the quiet cost of refusing to listen, like the video, subscribe, and send it to someone who knows that the most dangerous thing buried in a backyard is not always a utility line. Sometimes it is the truth somebody assumed would stay underground.